As the police pieced together the fragmented clues, a singular and chilling realization emerged. Brian's composed demeanor, so steadfast on the surface, concealed an undercurrent of turmoil. Whitney's cryptic journals, Adam's subtle manipulations, and Brian's sudden, unexplainable disappearance all painted a picture of devastating complexity. The very lies that once held their marriage together had morphed into a catalyst for betrayal, one that would end not merely in heartbreak but in unthinkable tragedy. Was it love, vengeance, or despair that spurred Brian's ultimate decisions? Before delving into this gripping tale of deception, heartbreak, and retribution, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. The Hayes home stood quietly on a serene, tree-lined street in Springfield, a picturesque suburban neighborhood straight from the glossy pages of a real estate magazine. Behind the walls of their pristine two-story home, Brian Hayes moved through his days with the practiced rhythm of a man who had built his life meticulously, brick by brick. An electrician by trade, Brian was known for his reliability and precision, qualities that had earned him a stellar reputation at GL Tech. At 36, he was a picture of vigor, blonde hair, striking blue eyes, and a sturdy physique honed through years of labor. Yet beneath his confident exterior, unease had begun to fester. His wife, Whitney Hayes, was everything Brian wasn't. At 35, she was a disciplined and ambitious sociology professor, newly minted as a junior faculty member at a local college. Her sharp intellect and meticulous nature were matched only by her beauty, long raven black hair and piercing eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to the truth. For 8 years, their marriage had appeared solid, their differences harmonizing like complementary notes in a song. But recently, Brian had begun to sense subtle yet undeniable shifts in Whitney's behavior. The unease. Whitney's once natural warmth had turned fleeting, replaced by an almost mechanical politeness. Her gaze often lingered on nothing in particular, lost in thoughts she didn't share. Sometimes she seemed unervingly accommodating, smoothing over cracks in their relationship Brian hadn't noticed until her actions brought them into focus. Most disconcerting of all was her sudden insistence on boundaries, particularly regarding an upcoming seminar in Cincinnati. "It's a great opportunity for you," Brian had remarked one evening, his voice light as he dried the dinner plates. "Maybe I should take a couple of days off and come with you. We could explore when you're not at the seminar." Her hands froze mid-wash, her voice unnaturally sharp. Known realizing the edge in her tone, she softened it. "I mean, we've already planned the spring break cruise, remember? Let's save our time together for that." Brian frowned, her response leaving a faint bitterness in the air. "If you're sure," he replied cautiously, watching her carefully for any sign of why she was suddenly so averse to his company. Whitney's laughter came too quickly, too easily. "It'll be fine, I promise. This trip is important for my career. I just need to focus." Her words, though logical, gnawed at Brian. Why was she so adamant about going alone? And why now, when they had always found ways to support each other? Shadows of doubt. As the seminar loomed closer, Whitney's meticulous nature reached an almost frantic intensity. She packed well in advance, her movements deliberate and precise. Conversations about work became curt. Even casual mentions of her teaching assistant, Adam Torres, had ceased entirely. Brian couldn't help but notice the growing distance between them. The connection that once felt effortless now seemed like a strained performance. The morning of her departure, Whitney kissed Brian goodbye with practiced ease. Her suitcase was already in the car, and she paused at the door, her smile faint but distant. "Don't forget to eat something besides pizza while I'm gone," she teased lightly before driving away. Standing in the empty house, Brian felt a weight settle in his chest. The quiet seemed oppressive. He glanced at the cruise tickets pinned to the bulletin board, a token of a happier time, and wondered why he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply amiss. The discovery. Later that evening, as he wandered through their bedroom, Brian's gaze landed on a travel bag Whitney had forgotten to take with her. Curious, he picked it up, intending to stow it neatly in the closet. As he moved it, a small red leather journal tumbled out from beneath. Brian froze, his breath catching in his throat. Whitney's journals had always been private. She never left them out in the open, nor did she ever speak of their contents. The brass lock gleamed ominously in the dim light, almost daring him to uncover its secrets. For a long moment, Brian simply stared at the journal, his mind a battlefield of trust and suspicion. Finally, unable to resist the gnawing questions in his mind, he resolved to open it. Secrets unveiled. The next day, Brian discreetly purchased an identical red journal with a matching lock from a specialty store downtown. The cost of his duplicity felt steep, but his doubts outweighed the guilt. Returning home, he carefully unlocked Whitney's journal with the newly purchased key and flipped to the first page. The entries began innocently enough. Whitney's thoughts on her new job, the challenges of juggling responsibilities, and her excitement over career opportunities. But as he read further, the tone shifted. September 8th, my new assistant Adam Torres started today. He's tall, charismatic, and commands attention effortlessly. The female students adore him. I can't deny he's capable. Brian's hands trembled as he turned the pages, each word confirming his worst fears. Brian reread the passage, his pulse quickening. Adam, the name sent a jolt through his memory. Whitney had spoken of him often earlier in the semester, but the name had faded from their conversations weeks ago. Now, seeing it inked in her careful handwriting, the omission felt deliberate, conspicuous. As he continued reading, another entry stopped him cold. September 24th. Spent hours working with Adam on class readings. He's sharper than I expected. I've been thinking about starting a family with Brian, but it's hard to focus on that with work feeling so overwhelming. Brian's grip tightened on the journal as an unsettling mix of emotions churned in his chest. The thought of Whitney considering their future together, while Adam lingered on the periphery of her thoughts, felt like a bitter betrayal. The next entry turned his unease into outright dread. October 10th. Adam locked the door during our meeting today. I told him it wasn't appropriate, but he just laughed, saying no one would notice. I didn't know how to respond, so I let it go. I feel conflicted. The knot in Brian's stomach tightened as he flipped through the pages, Whitney's handwriting becoming hurried and uneven, slanting sharply as though mirroring her inner turmoil. The tension between her and Adam grew palpable, an undeniable current that seemed to electrify every word. September 30th. Adam smiled at me during my lecture again. I frowned, hoping to discourage him, but he didn't look away. After class he stayed behind to talk. His confidence is unnerving. It's like he knows exactly what he's doing. I told him I'm married and he just grinned, saying, "Happily, I hope." I should have felt insulted, but instead I felt unsettled. Brian's breath quickened as he read further, the entries painting a picture of Whitney caught in an emotional whirlwind. The once steady strokes of her pen faltered, reflecting her struggle to maintain control. Her words became tinged with hesitation and guilt, and her descriptions of Adam's behavior grew bolder. October 16th. I shouldn't have let him close the door again. When Adam asked why I seemed distant, I laughed it off, but his eyes searched mine like he already knew. Then he hugged me, too long, too tightly, and I didn't pull away fast enough. For a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to let go, but the thought left me ashamed. This has to stop. Brian's fists clenched, anger rising alongside a deep sadness. Whitney wasn't just battling Adam's persistence. She was struggling against her own weakening boundaries. And Adam's behavior wasn't just bold, it was predatory, exploiting every crack in her defenses. October 20th. He locked the door again today, saying he needed privacy to discuss something important. When I asked him to leave it open, he smirked and ignored me. He leaned against my desk and told me I deserved better than Brian. How could he know that? I pushed him away, but the way he looked at me, it's like he's always in control. I hate that part of me liked it. Brian's jaw tightened, fury sparking at the casual dismissal of her protests and the audacity of Adam's insinuations. Each entry revealed Whitney's guilt and Adam's relentless manipulation, a dangerous dynamic spiraling further out of control. November 9th. Adam crossed another line today. I've tried to tell him we need distance, but he keeps finding reasons to stay close. When I told him this couldn't happen again, he laughed and said, "It already has." He's right, I can't undo what's been done. But I can end this. After the seminar, it's over. Brian shut the journal with trembling hands, its weight echoing the burden now settling in his chest. Whitney's words laid bare a mind caught between temptation and remorse, a marriage cracking under the strain of unspoken truths. For the first time, Brian felt like a stranger in his own life. He reached for a second journal tucked in the shoebox, his resolve hardening. He needed the full picture, no matter how devastating it might be. The plan for proof. The hours after reading Whitney's journals passed in a haze. Brian sat at the kitchen table, the journals closed but their revelations seared into his mind. The anger that had first overwhelmed him simmered into a cold, calculated resolve. He couldn't confront Whitney without irrefutable proof. He needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. After pacing the living room with his phone clutched tightly in hand, he made a decision. He searched online for private investigators, landing on the website of Pearsall Investigations. Their tagline, "Clarity in the Shadows," resonated deeply. When Brian called, his voice was taut, betraying the storm raging inside him. "Pearsall Investigations. How can we help?" came the calm, professional voice of a receptionist. Brian hesitated, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Finally he managed, "I need evidence of infidelity. My wife, I think she's cheating." The receptionist transferred him to Francis Hopkins, a seasoned investigator whose steady tone helped ground Brian. "Tell me everything," Hopkins urged. Brian recounted the details he'd uncovered in the journals, his voice cracking as he described Whitney's entries about Adam. Hopkins listened without interruption, then outlined a plan. "We'll install discrete cameras in her hotel room and the adjacent one. If she's meeting this man, we'll capture it. Photos and videos, is that what you're looking for?" "Yes," Brian whispered, the pit in his stomach twisting. "That's exactly what I need." The evidence. The following evening Brian received a call. "It's done," Hopkins said. "We've got photos. I'll email them now." Brian opened his laptop, his hands shaking as he clicked on the email. The first photo showed Whitney entering her hotel room with Adam, his hand lightly brushing her back. The second captured their silhouettes through a crack in the door, close, intimate. The final image struck him like a blow. Adam leaning in to kiss Whitney, her face tilted toward his. The intimacy was undeniable. Brian stared at the images, his vision blurring as tears welled up, but he blinked them away, anger hardening into resolve. The photos felt like daggers, each one slicing through the fabric of their marriage. The next move. Brian placed the photos in an envelope, leaving it on the kitchen counter. He sat in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at them, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Confronting Whitney outright would lead to lies, excuses, and more heartbreak. Instead, he decided to act strategically. The first step was financial. Early the next morning, Brian went to the bank, his pulse racing as he approached the teller. "I need to make a withdrawal," he said, sliding his ID across the counter. The teller smiled politely. "How much?" "20,000, Brian replied, his voice steady despite the storm within. The teller's eyes widened briefly, her professionalism swiftly masking her surprise. "I'll need the manager's approval for that amount," she said, her tone measured. "One moment, please." As she walked away, Brian's mind churned with unease. Was this unusual request too conspicuous? Could Whitney somehow catch wind of his actions? He tapped his fingers against the counter, glancing around the sterile bank lobby, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. When the teller returned with the manager in tow, they handed him a discreet envelope. "Is there anything else we can assist you with, Mr. Hayes?" the manager asked politely. Brian shook his head, forcing a curt smile. "No, thank you. That will be all." Exiting the bank, he inhaled deeply, the crisp morning air doing little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. The envelope, its bulk palpable in his grip, felt heavier than mere cash. It was the weight of his decision, the first tangible step toward severing ties with his old life. Later that morning, Brian pulled into the parking lot of GL Tech, the company where he had spent the past 6 years. The familiar building, with its gray, nondescript facade, seemed to mock him with memories of stability and routine. Inside, as he emptied his locker, his supervisor Grant approached, a look of surprise etched on his face. "Brian?" Grant called out. "What's going on? Are you clearing out?" Brian hesitated, the truth lodging itself in his throat. "Yeah," he finally said. "I need to take some time off. Personal reasons." Grant's brow furrowed with concern. "You're one of our best guys, Brian. Is this permanent?" Brian shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know yet. I just need a break." Grant nodded slowly, his expression one of reluctant understanding. They shook hands, Grant's grip firm and reassuring, but it only deepened the ache of leaving behind a piece of himself. Walking back to his car, Brian couldn't help but feel a pang of regret, the weight of yet another loss pressing on his shoulders. Back at home, the kitchen table became Brian's war room. He spread out a notepad, sketching the outline of a plan that was equal parts calculated and desperate. Cancel his phone. Find temporary lodging. Sell his car and replace the plates. Each item was another thread he would cut from the tapestry of the life he once cherished. His gaze fell on the cruise tickets pinned to the bulletin board, a symbol of the future he and Whitney had planned together. Rising abruptly, he tore them down, the paper crumpling in his hands. He tossed them into the trash, the sound reverberating in the quiet house like a final declaration. As night enveloped the house, Brian sat alone in the living room, the envelope of incriminating photos resting on the table in front of him. He had imagined leaving them out for Whitney to find, a silent confrontation, but even that felt too direct, too final. Instead, he slipped the envelope into a drawer. Discovery would come later, when he was long gone. By midnight, his bag was packed and loaded into his car. As he drove away from the home they had built together, he didn't look back. This wasn't just an escape, it was the beginning of a life untethered by betrayal. Whitney stepped through the front door, the familiar creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering in from the kitchen. The house felt unnaturally still, as though it had been holding its breath in her absence. Normally, Brian would be there to greet her with a tired smile or a warm hug, but tonight the space felt void of life. Her heels clicked softly against the wooden floor as she entered the kitchen, the faint smell of pizza and stale beer lingering in the air. The table was almost empty, save for a single sheet of paper pinned beneath the salt shaker. Whitney's heart sank as she recognized Brian's handwriting. The sharp knock at the door startled Whitney. Setting down her half-empty coffee mug, she glanced at the clock. Barely 8 a.m. Peering through the window, she froze. A police cruiser sat in her driveway, its lights off but unmistakable. A chill crept down her spine. Pulling her robe tighter around her, she opened the door to find two men standing on her porch. One was tall, his graying hair lending him an air of authority, while the other, in uniform, carried a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mrs. Hayes?" the older man asked. "Yes," she replied, her voice uncertain. "I'm Detective Valdez and this is Officer Santos. May we come in?" Whitney hesitated, her heart pounding. "Is something wrong?" Valdez's expression was professional, but his voice softened slightly. "We need to speak with you regarding Adam Torres." Inside, the kitchen felt suffocating. Whitney clutched her mug, her knuckles white against the ceramic. "Adam Torres," she echoed, the name sounding foreign on her lips. Valdez's tone was measured, deliberate. "We regret to inform you that Mr. Torres was found dead last night. His body was discovered at his residence." The room spun around her. "Dead?" she whispered, the word barely audible. Valdez nodded. "We're still determining the details, but a call was made to report his murder. The call came from your husband's phone." The statement hit her like a physical blow. "Brian?" she stammered. "No. That's impossible. He wasn't even—" Santos interrupted, his voice flat. "The phone was traced to Niagara Falls, Ontario, where we also recovered a discarded pistol matching the caliber used in the attack." Whitney stared at them, her mind a storm of disbelief and confusion. "Brian?" she whispered again, her voice cracking under the weight of realization. Before the estimated time of death, Whitney shook her head vehemently, her voice rising in disbelief. "Brian would never do this. He didn't even know Adam." Detective Valdez leaned forward, his eyes sharp but his tone steady. "Are you certain about that? We found photographs near the body, pictures of you and Mr. Torres. They appear to have been taken recently." Whitney's hands trembled, her face paling as the words sank in. The implication felt suffocating, yet she clung desperately to her denial. "No. Brian wouldn't hurt anyone. You've got it wrong. Someone must have stolen his phone, or set him up." The detectives exchanged a glance, their skepticism unspoken but palpable. Valdez stood, sliding a card across the table. "If you think of anything, call us." "But Mrs. Hayes," he added, his tone cautious, "if your husband contacts you, we strongly advise you to inform us immediately." As the detectives left, the door closing behind them, Whitney sank into a chair, her thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirl. The house felt colder, emptier than ever, and for the first time she wondered how well she truly knew Brian. At the edge of Niagara Falls, a ghostly mist shrouded the powerful cascade, the roar of the water echoing in the deserted evening. Tourists had long since departed, leaving an eerie quiet in their wake. It was here, amidst nature's overwhelming grandeur, that investigators uncovered remnants of Brian Hayes' life. In a trash bin near the parking lot, police found his phone, its battery drained, and a worn leather wallet stripped of cash but still holding his ID and credit cards. Beneath the bin liner, a .25 caliber pistol with its serial number filed off rested ominously. Not far away, discarded license plates with jagged edges, hastily removed, added another layer to the mystery. Detective Valdez surveyed the scene, his brows knit in concentration. He's either long gone or planning something bigger, he murmured to Officer Santos, who stood nearby jotting notes. Santos glanced at the discarded pistol. Think he's still here? Or is this a smokescreen? Valdez shook his head, his expression grim. If he was planning to jump, we'd have found him by now. My guess? He's buying himself time, setting the stage to vanish. The evidence painted a portrait of a man in motion, escaping, perhaps, or laying a trail of misdirection. Yet without a body or further clues, every theory led to a dead end. Back at the Hayes home, Whitney sat at the kitchen table, a stack of journals retrieved from the dresser in front of her. Her fingers hovered over their worn leather covers, each brass lock gleaming under the dim light. Taking a shaky breath, she unlocked one and began to read. Her tears blurred the ink as she flipped through the final entries, each word a sharp reminder of her own turmoil. The writing was hurried, raw, filled with the weight of her choices. Over and over, the same phrases leaped out at her. I hate what I've become. Brian deserves better. After this seminar, I'll end it. I'll focus on us. Whitney's hands trembled as she turned another page, her chest tightening with guilt. She could no longer deny her role in the unraveling of their marriage. It wasn't just Adam's persistence or Brian's growing distance. It was her choices, her failure to set boundaries when it mattered most. Her breath caught as she reached the final entry, Brian's name scrawled in hurried letters. I love him, but I'm scared he'll never forgive me. How can I face him now? The journal slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Whitney pressed her hands to her face, her sobs breaking the oppressive silence. Each tear carried the weight of guilt, shame, and despair, emotions crashing into her like the relentless flow of Niagara Falls itself. She replayed the moments of her betrayal, the stolen glances, the excuses she told herself, the locked doors she thought would protect her secrets. I ruined it, she whispered to the empty room. I ruined everything. Her grief gave way to anger. In a surge of emotion, she swept the journals from the table, sending them scattering across the floor. Their echoes faded into the stillness, leaving her in a void of regret. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. She sank to the floor, clutching one of the journals to her chest, staring blankly at the wall. Days turned into weeks, yet the search for Brian Hayes yielded little more than questions. Niagara Falls remained the last confirmed trace of him. Surveillance footage showed his car entering the border checkpoint, but there was no record of it leaving. Officers scoured nearby motels, parks, and roadside stops, but every lead evaporated into frustration. The discarded items, his phone, wallet, and license plates, offered no insight into his next move. Detective Valdez pored over the evidence repeatedly, muttering, "A man like Hayes doesn't just disappear." But as weeks stretched into months, the case stalled, fading into the background of other unresolved mysteries. At home, Whitney sat in the oppressive quiet, her once meticulous routines now replaced by aimless wandering. Each room echoed with memories of Brian. His laughter, his quiet moments of focus, even the faint creak of his footsteps on the stairs. The journals remained tucked away, their contents haunting her. She avoided friends and colleagues, unable to bear their questions or pity. Her nights were consumed by relentless what-ifs. Some nights, she imagined Brian alive, staring at the same sunset from some faraway place. Other nights, she feared the worst. The not knowing gnawed at her, a punishment she felt she deserved. She replayed every conversation, every argument, every missed opportunity to make things right. Their marriage, once a source of comfort and joy, now felt like a jagged wound she couldn't heal. Months later, as the search for Brian came to an official standstill, Whitney received a letter. The familiar handwriting brought fresh tears to her eyes. Whitney, I've gone far away, and this is my final decision. I loved you, but the trust is gone, and I can't live with what's happened. Find yourself again. You deserve peace. Goodbye. The letter trembled in her hands as she read the words again and again. This was the closure she feared, and the push she needed. Brian wasn't coming back. His words were a farewell, but also a quiet plea for her to rebuild her life. Whitney sold the house, locked away the journals, and vowed to move forward. Somewhere she hoped Brian had found the freedom he sought. And as for her, she would start anew, carrying the lessons of her mistakes and the faint hope that one day she might forgive herself.